I never thought that the final years of my life would turn into such a strange mixture of silence, disappointment, and heavy reflection. And if anyone had asked me 20 years ago how I imagined my old age, I would have described something entirely different, something softer, warmer, a picture where the house was full of laughter, the smell of food, visits from children and grandchildren, and occasional chaos that felt alive rather than destructive. And yet, now I find myself waking up in a house that feels as though it has been hollowed out from the inside, as though the walls themselves hold their breath, waiting for me to break the silence with a cough or the shuffle of my slippers. And sometimes I think the only living things that acknowledge my presence are the birds outside the window that still tap against the glass, as if reminding me that the world goes on, whether I like it or not. My name is Leonard, though everyone used to call me Len, and I am 76 years old, a man who once believed that life had a way of rewarding those who worked hard, stayed honest, and kept faith with their family. But lately I have begun to doubt whether such beliefs were anything more than illusions we cling to so that disappointment does not eat us alive too early. I live in the same old 2-story house where my late wife Margaret and I raised our daughter, where we marked birthdays with cakes that were always too sweet and arguments that never lasted more than a day, where the creak of the staircase used to be a familiar sound of life in motion, a signal that someone was home, and where now that same creak sounds more like a reminder of emptiness. Margaret has been gone for almost 10 years, taken from me by a sudden heart attack on a cold November morning, and in the years since, I've come to realize how much of my own vitality was tied to her laughter, her way of filling a room with certainty that no matter what happened, we would handle it together. When she left, something fundamental left with her, though for a long time I did not admit it even to myself. I kept moving through the motions, kept up with the rituals of coffee in the morning and the evening news, kept the house tidy, paid the bills, trimmed the hedges, but all of it was a kind of stubborn resistance against admitting how empty life had become without her. My daughter Claire visits from time to time, though more out of a sense of obligation than genuine affection, and I can feel that difference even when she tries to disguise it with hurried smiles and polite questions. She has her own life, her own children, and, of course, her husband Michael, a man who has always carried a sharp edge beneath his politeness, the kind of son-in-law who knows how to shake your hand too firmly, who knows how to make you feel smaller in a conversation by reminding you of how outdated your ideas are, how the world has moved on, how men like me are relics better left to sit quietly in the corner while younger voices decide what matters. I never truly got along with Michael, though I tried, Lord knows I tried, for Claire's sake, for the sake of not becoming the kind of bitter father who poisons his daughter's marriage with constant disapproval. Still, beneath the surface of every holiday dinner, every shared outing, every so-called family moment, there was that friction, that subtle dismissal in his tone when he called me old man, even as a joke, that way of making me feel as though I were already half out of the world and should act accordingly. Life in old age is not just about the body betraying you with stiff knees and shortness of breath. It is about a slow erasure, a diminishing of presence, as if the world around you gently but firmly pushes you toward the margins. And sometimes it is. Not strangers who do the pushing, but those who should have been your anchor, your family. I spend most of my days alone, making simple meals, reading books that I have already read twice before, walking slowly down to the park when the weather is forgiving, and coming back to the quiet that grows heavier at night. I tell myself that I am fortunate, that I still have a roof over my head, that I still have a mind that works, that there are many who suffer worse, but beneath those reminders there is an ache, a gnawing sense that I have been left behind, not just by the world at large, but by the very people for whom I sacrificed, for whom I worked long hours, for whom I gave the best years of my life. There was a time, not so long ago in the scale of a lifetime, when I was respected in my work as a teacher, when young men and women sat in my classroom and looked to me for guidance, when parents thanked me for shaping their children's futures, when my name still carried weight, but now when people hear my name, it is just another old man, another retiree whose life has shrunk to doctor's appointments and pension checks, Sometimes I sit by the window in the evening and watch the neighborhood change. New families move in. Children ride bicycles on the same street where Claire once learned to ride hers. And I see their parents cheering them on, holding the handlebars, running alongside, and I remember doing the same, my heart pounding with pride, my wife clapping from the porch. The memory comes back with such clarity that for a moment it feels like yesterday until I blink and realize how many years have slipped past and I am alone again with the sound of the clock ticking. Old age is not only about the past pressing itself upon you, it is also about how the present world treats you. And that is where the sharpest pain lies. For all my effort to maintain dignity, to remain useful, to contribute, I have begun to notice how people speak over me, how they assume I cannot understand, how they dismiss my words as ramblings, and sometimes the cruelest of those voices belong to my own daughter and her husband. I know Claire loves me in some complicated way, perhaps more as a duty than as an affection. But Michael, my son-in-law, has no such restraint. He makes it clear, sometimes through silence, sometimes through remarks that cut deeper than he knows, that in his eyes I am an old burden clinging to relevance. He thinks I do not hear the way he speaks about me when he thinks I am not listening, the way he tells Claire that I should move into assisted living, that it would be better for everyone, Lalac, the way he sighs when I ask a question at the dinner table, as if the effort of answering me is too heavy a price to pay for sharing a meal. I try not to let it break me. I try to hold on to whatever fragments of dignity I still possess. But the truth is that these moments pile up inside me. They linger in my chest long after the house grows quiet again. And sometimes at night I hear Margaret's voice in my memory telling me not to take it too hard, telling me to stand tall, telling me that a man's worth is not measured by the way others see him, but by the truth he carries within. I cling to that. I cling to her memory because without it the bitterness would consume me. And so here I am, 76 years old, a widower, a father, a grandfather, a man who thought he would spend his final years in the warmth of family, surrounded by the people he once carried on his shoulders, only to find himself standing alone, trying to reconcile the man he once was with the way he is treated now. I still make my own coffee every morning. I still walk carefully down those creaking stairs that seem steeper every year. I still hope that when the phone rings it will be Claire calling just to say hello, though more often than not it is some stranger offering insurance or services I do not need. I still keep a drawer filled with Margaret's letters, yellowed with time, because they remind me of who I was when life still felt full. I still wait for the day when the house will again feel like home, rather than a place of waiting. And yet beneath all of this, there is a truth I can no longer ignore. Old age does not just strip away strength. It reveals who truly stands by you when the years have worn you thin, and in that revelation lies both the deepest sorrow and, perhaps, the seed of a strength I did not know I had left. It was on a Sunday evening, one of those gray Midwestern days when the sky hangs low and the damp air makes every step feel heavier, when the event occurred that changed the rhythm of my life forever, though at first it began in the most ordinary way, as so many catastrophes do. Claire had invited me to dinner at their house, something that happened rarely enough that I felt compelled to go even when my joints were aching, and I would have preferred to remain at home with a book, because whenever she extended the invitation, I convinced myself that perhaps this time it would be different. Perhaps this time the distance between us would narrow, and perhaps even Michael would soften his perpetual disdain for me. I ironed my best shirt, polished the old shoes that Margaret once teased me for keeping long past their prime, and carried a bottle of red wine that had been gathering dust in my cupboard, a gesture of goodwill, though I suspected Michael would sneer at it as outdated or cheap compared to his expensive tastes. Their house was brightly lit when I arrived, the sound of television leaking through the walls, and when Claire opened the door she hugged me quickly, with that mixture of haste and duty that always stung more than she knew, and led me inside, where the table was already set. The grandchildren were in the living room, their heads bent over glowing screens, barely glancing up to greet me, and though it pierced my heart, I told myself it was not their fault, that this was the world they were born into, that perhaps they did not even know what it meant to show reverence to an old man anymore. Michael was in the kitchen carving the roast, his sleeves rolled up, his movements sharp and efficient, and when he looked up at me, there was that glint in his eyes, that thin smile that said more than words ever could, that I was tolerated, nothing more. Dinner began politely enough, with Claire making small talk about her office, about the children's schoolwork, about the rising cost of everything these days, while Michael interjected from time to time with his confident, cutting observations as though he were delivering verdicts rather than participating in a conversation. I tried to contribute here and there, mentioning an article I had read, recalling how things had been different decades ago, not to preach, but simply to share. But each time Michael would tilt his head, smile that cold smile, and correct me or tell me that I did not understand how things worked now, that the world had changed, and there was a tone of finality in his voice that left no room for discussion. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, not anger exactly, but the ache of being reduced to a caricature of senility in the very home where I should have been respected as the patriarch. It was after dessert, when the plates had been cleared and the grandchildren retreated upstairs, that the conversation shifted, as it always seemed to, toward what Michael called practical matters. He began to speak about my house, about how difficult it must be for me to manage on my own, about how many accidents occur to people my age when they insist on living alone, about how assisted living facilities nowadays were comfortable and safe, and how Claire and he could help me arrange something. Claire sat silently beside him, her eyes lowered as if she had rehearsed this scene many times in her head and could not quite bring herself to speak it aloud. I felt my pulse quicken, the familiar humiliation of being spoken about rather than to, and I told them, with as much firmness as I could muster, that I had no intention of leaving my home, that I was capable of managing, that I had lived in that house longer than they had been married and would die under its roof rather than be shepherded into some sterile corridor lined with strangers. Michael's smile thinned into a smirk, and he leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his wine, and said something that froze the air between us. "The problem, Len, is that it's not just about what you want anymore. At some point your decisions affect all of us, and if you can't recognize when it's time to step aside, someone has to recognize it for you." I stared at him, unable to believe that he had spoken so plainly, and for a moment Claire glanced at me with something like pity, but she did not correct him. She did not defend me. She merely folded her hands and let the silence stretch until I broke it by standing up. My knees protested, the old ache gnawed at my bones, but I would not remain seated like a child being scolded, so I rose and told them both that I would be leaving. It was then, as I made my way toward the stairs that led down to the front door, that the moment of betrayal came. Michael followed me, his voice sharp now, less measured, telling me not to walk away from the conversation, telling me that I always made everything harder than it needed to be, and as I reached the top of the staircase, turning to tell him I had heard enough, I saw the flash of irritation twist across his face. He stepped closer, too close, and with a sudden shove of his hand against my shoulder, I was no longer standing but falling, the world tilting beneath me, the steps rushing up in a blur of carpet and wood and pain. I remember the sound more than anything, the sickening crack as my body struck each step, the helpless flailing of my arms as I tried to stop myself, the realization in those endless seconds that this was not an accident, that my own son-in-law had pushed me, and that my daughter would have to decide whether to acknowledge it or bury it beneath lies. When I finally hit the bottom, breathless and stunned, the pain radiating through my ribs and hip, I could hear Claire scream my name from above, could hear Michael muttering that I had slipped, that I had lost my balance, that it was not his fault. My vision swam with tears of pain, my breath caught in my throat, and yet even through the haze I knew that the fall was no accident, that the shove had been deliberate, that this was the raw truth of how far I had fallen in their eyes, from father to burden, from man to obstacle. Claire rushed down to me, kneeling by my side, her hands trembling as she tried to help, and I looked at her through the blur and saw the conflict in her eyes, the war between blood and loyalty to the man she had chosen. Michael stood at the top of the stairs, his hands on his hips, his expression unreadable, and in that silence I understood more than I ever wished to, that I was no longer safe among my own family. The ambulance came, the paramedics lifting me onto the stretcher, their voices calm and professional as they asked questions. But over it all I could hear Michael's steady insistence that I had stumbled, that it was no one's fault, and Claire nodding along, her voice thin and trembling as she echoed his version. I wanted to shout, to tell them the truth, to name the betrayal, but the pain in my chest and the dizziness in my head silenced me, and I let them wheel me out into the night. The cold air stinging my face, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and despair. I had entered that house hoping for a meal, a little warmth, perhaps even a small sign that I still belonged, and I left it broken, carried out like a casualty of war, betrayed not by strangers but by the people who should have been my refuge. The hospital became my reluctant refuge, though even in that place of sterile walls and antiseptic smells, I did not feel entirely safe, because what gnawed at me was not only the pain of broken bones and bruised flesh, but the unbearable awareness that the story of how I had come to be there was already being rewritten in ways that erased the truth. When the doctors asked what had happened before I could even gather the strength to answer, Claire spoke up with a brittle smile, explaining that her father had slipped on the stairs after dinner, that he had grown dizzy, that it was a tragic accident but nothing more, and Michael nodded solemnly beside her as if lending his credibility to the account. I opened my mouth to protest, to say that it was no accident, that I had been pushed, but the words tangled with the pain in my ribs and the fog of medication, and when they emerged, they were weak and uncertain, and in the silence that followed it was their story that took root. Lying in the hospital bed with tubes in my arm and a dull ache throbbing through every limb, I had too much time to think, too much time to replay those seconds at the top of the staircase, to feel again the shove of Michael's hand, the helpless plunge downward, and the sickening realization that my daughter had chosen to stand beside her husband's lie, rather than defend her father's truth. The nurses were kind in their brisk, impersonal way, adjusting pillows, checking monitors, bringing me water with straws. But the real battle was not against the fractures in my body, but against the erosion of my dignity. Each time a nurse looked at me with polite sympathy, I wondered what version of me they had been told, whether they saw a frail old man too clumsy to keep his footing, whether they shook their heads privately at the foolishness of an elder who should have been in assisted living long ago. The indignity of being seen as weak, confused, incapable was more corrosive than the physical pain. Claire visited during the day, always for short stretches, always with a tone of forced cheerfulness, asking if I needed anything, fluffing the blanket as though such gestures could disguise the deeper wound between us, and always leaving quickly, as if she had appointments too pressing to linger. Michael came only once, standing at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed, offering a perfunctory, "Get well soon," that dripped with insincerity, and I could see in his eyes not remorse but calculation, as though he were already considering what this accident might allow him to accomplish. In those moments I realized that the fall had not only damaged my body, but had placed me in a vulnerable position from which they could attempt to seize control of the remnants of my life, my house, my savings, my independence. The first small humiliation came when a doctor, after consulting with Claire outside the room, entered to tell me gently that my daughter had expressed concern about my ability to manage at home, that perhaps I should consider rehabilitation in a facility rather than returning to my own house, and though I tried to argue, to insist that I was capable of returning home with perhaps a cane or walker, I could see the skepticism in his face, the way Claire's words had already shaped the narrative. It was as if I were no longer the primary voice in my own story, as if my words carried less weight simply because of the number of years I had lived. I wanted to shout that I had been a teacher for decades, that I had managed a household, raised a family, paid every bill on time, mowed the lawn with aching knees, and shoveled snow long after younger men would have hired help, that I was still in command of my mind, even if my body had faltered under violence. But the protest caught in my throat and came out sounding like the weak defiance of an old man unwilling to face reality. The second humiliation arrived in the form of paperwork. Claire brought in a small folder one afternoon, her expression carefully arranged into concern, and told me that the hospital needed certain authorizations signed so that she could handle the logistics of my care and insurance, that it was all routine, nothing to worry about, just a matter of efficiency. My hands trembled as I reached for the pen, but something in me, some faint flicker of the man I had once been, urged me to pause, to read the pages before me. The letters swam in front of my eyes, my reading glasses perched crookedly on my nose, and though the print was small and the legal language thick, I could see enough to realize that these were not mere authorizations for treatment, but broader. Powers, permissions that would give her and Michael control over aspects of my finances and property. When I asked why such things were necessary, she flushed, then smiled tightly, saying that I was mistaken, that I was reading too much into it, and urged me to sign quickly before the nurse returned. I pushed the papers back across the tray and told her no, that I would not sign until I had spoken with my own lawyer, and for a fleeting moment I saw something flash in her eyes, frustration mingled with something darker, before she masked it again. With a forced tenderness, the third and perhaps sharpest humiliation came when I overheard them, Claire and Michael, speaking outside my door late one evening when they assumed I was asleep. The voices carried down the corridor, muffled but clear enough, and I heard Michael say, "If we don't act now, we'll never have another chance. He's slipping, you can see it, and once he goes back home it'll be harder to prove." Claire murmured something I could not catch, perhaps a half-hearted protest, but Michael's reply was cold and certain. It's for his own good. He doesn't know what's best for himself anymore. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the words burning into me like acid, and for the first time in my life I felt truly abandoned, not only by my son-in-law, which I had long suspected might happen, but by my own daughter, the child I had carried in my arms, the girl whose scraped knees I had kissed, the young woman I had walked down the aisle, the only surviving piece of my life with Margaret. That she could conspire in whispers about taking from me what little independence I had left was a betrayal so profound that I thought my heart might crack under its weight. The days stretched into weeks, and though my body began to heal, though the bruises faded from purple to yellow and the fractures knitted slowly, my spirit remained raw. Nurses rotated, meals came and went, the television droned endlessly with news of a world that no longer seemed to have space for me, and every night I lay awake wondering how a man could survive being made invisible by his own blood. There were moments when I thought of Margaret and whispered her name into the silence, asking her what I should do, how I should fight, how I should endure. I imagined her beside me, telling me not to give in, telling me that even when surrounded by lies, the truth remains the only weapon worth wielding. Yet what cut deepest of all were not the lies spoken to doctors or the papers slid across my tray, but the looks from my grandchildren when they visited once or twice. They stood at the foot of the bed, awkward, restless, murmuring, "Hi, Grandpa," before retreating to their phones, but once, just once, when Michael had stepped out and Claire was adjusting the blanket, my grandson lifted his eyes to mine, and there was something there, something like shame, and in that flicker I understood that he knew, that perhaps both of them knew, that the story of my fall was false, but they were too young, too frightened, too bound by dependence on their parents to speak it aloud. That silent acknowledgment was both a comfort and a torment, for it meant I was not entirely mad in my certainty, but it also meant that the truth was imprisoned in the eyes of children who could not free it. Thus the first escalation of my ordeal was not in the physical realm, but in the slow erosion of my identity, the way every interaction, every document, every whispered word pushed me further into the role of a frail, confused old man who had lost control of his life. They thought they were burying me quietly under the weight of their lies, but as I lay there, aching and humiliated, something else stirred inside me, something that refused to be erased. It was faint. It was fragile, but it was there, the beginning of a resolve that if they believed I was too weak to defend myself, then they did not know me at all. The turning point came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet conversation that at first seemed ordinary, the kind that one might forget within a day, yet it carried within it the spark that shifted everything, It was the third week of my hospital stay, my ribs still tender, my hip aching whenever I tried to move too quickly, but my mind sharper than it had been in months because the bitterness of betrayal had burned away the fog of resignation. I was sitting in the wheelchair near the window, looking out at the parking lot where cars came and went in a rhythm that felt indifferent to the turmoil of any single life, when the attending physician entered with a clipboard in his hand. He was a younger man, polite in the automatic way of professionals, but he hesitated as though uncertain whether to speak what was on his mind. At last, in a voice that was careful and cautious, he said that my daughter had approached him about arranging a psychological evaluation to determine whether I was still capable of independent living, and, if the results suggested otherwise, she intended to apply for temporary guardianship over my affairs. The words struck me like another fall down another set of stairs, though this time the wound was not to my bones, but to my very existence. Guardianship, the word alone was a verdict, a declaration that I was no longer myself, that I was a shadow requiring management, that my voice would be stripped from me in the decisions that shaped my remaining years. I asked the doctor what he thought, whether he himself had seen any signs of confusion, of incapacity, and he looked me directly in the eyes and said no, that in his professional judgment I was lucid and competent, but that family petitions sometimes carried weight and that courts often erred on the side of caution when elder patients were involved. He spoke kindly, but the underlying message was cruelly clear. If Claire and Michael pressed hard enough, if they manufactured the appearance of frailty, they might succeed in reducing me to a ward of their control. That night I could not sleep, not only because of the pain in my body, but because of the storm in my mind. I kept hearing Margaret's voice from years ago in those final months before her heart betrayed her, when she had written me small notes and tucked them into books or drawers for me to find later, as if she somehow knew she would not be with me long. One note had said simply, "If the day comes when you feel your own child does not stand beside you, remember that truth itself is your ally. Hold on to it, even if no one else will." I remembered that note now, the paper yellowed but still tucked into my desk at home, and the words gave me a steadiness I had not felt since the night of the fall. If they were preparing to strip me of everything under the guise of protection, then I would have to fight, not with fists or with shouting, but with patience, clarity, and the weight of truth. The true midpoint came 2 days later when a social worker visited my room. She introduced herself as part of the hospital's elder care liaison program, said she had been requested by my daughter to review my circumstances, and began asking questions that seemed simple on the surface but carried barbed hooks beneath. Did I remember the date? Could I state the name of the president? Did I know my medications and schedule? I answered carefully, clearly, determined not to let fatigue blur my words. She nodded, made notes, asked more. How did I manage my bills, my shopping, my meals? Did I ever forget to turn off the stove, ever get lost while walking, ever confuse names? With each question I felt as though I were being prodded toward a cliff's edge, one slip of the tongue away from being branded incompetent. At last she closed her folder with a polite smile and said she would file her report. I asked her directly whether she believed I needed guardianship, and for a moment her professional mask slipped and she said quietly, almost conspiratorially, "Between you and me, sir, no, you're fine. But families can be persuasive when they insist." It was then that the full weight of the betrayal crystallized. Michael's shove had not been an act of rage alone, but part of a larger plan, one in which the fall could be framed as evidence of my weakness, one in which my protests would be dismissed as the ramblings of a confused old man, and one in which my daughter would step forward as the responsible guardian who only wanted to protect her father. I felt the fury rise again, but alongside it came something else, a clarity of purpose, the recognition that I could no longer drift passively, waiting for kindness from people who had none left to give. If they wanted a battle over my dignity, then they would have one, but it would not be fought with anger. It would be fought with documentation, with witnesses, with careful steps that could not be twisted. That evening, after the visitors had gone and the corridors had grown quiet, I asked the night nurse if she could bring me the hospital phone. With trembling fingers, I dialed the number of the lawyer who had once helped me settle Margaret's affairs after her passing, a man named Harrison, whom I had not spoken to in years. He sounded surprised to hear from me, but when I explained slowly and clearly what had happened, how I had fallen, how Michael had pushed me, how Claire had echoed his lies, and how now there were whispers of guardianship and evaluations, his voice grew sharp with outrage. He told me not to sign anything, not to agree to any assessment without independent counsel, and that he would visit me the next morning. When I hung up the phone, my hands still shaking, I felt for the first time in weeks a faint surge of strength, as though I had reached across the abyss and found a rope strong enough to hold me. The midpoint of this long descent was therefore not despair, but awakening. I understood now that I was not merely enduring a family conflict or the ordinary trials of old age. I was caught in a battle for my very autonomy, a battle against those who should have been my protectors, but had chosen to be my usurpers. As I lay back in the hospital bed, exhausted but strangely calm, I told myself that if I could survive the fall down the stairs, then I could survive this as well, and that perhaps, just perhaps, I would not only endure, but rise from it with a vindication they could never erase. Harrison arrived the next morning with the brisk, contained energy of a man who has spent his life rescuing clients from the edge of legal sinkholes, and as he stood by my hospital bed, flipping through a yellow legal pad already crowded with tightly written notes, I felt the first solid sensation of ground beneath me since the night of the fall, because he did not look at me the way others had begun to, as if age itself were a disqualifying condition, but with the steady regard one offers a person whose account is presumed truthful until proven otherwise, and in that recognition my spine straightened and my voice grew calm as I told him in precise detail what had happened on the staircase and what had unfolded in the days since. He listened without interruption, only occasionally asking me to clarify a time or a phrase, and when I finished he said we would move on 2 fronts at once, one to prevent any quiet seizure of my life through guardianship, the other to establish the facts of the assault in a way that could not be dismissed as an old man's grievance. And then, as if he had anticipated my next breath, he produced a stapled packet authorizing a comprehensive, independent neuropsychological evaluation to establish my competence beyond challenge, as well as a letter rescinding any blanket permissions Claire might have slipped into the hospital file, and another instructing the staff that all treatment and discharge decisions were to be communicated to me and to him and to no one else until further notice. By noon, the social worker had returned with a tighter smile, acknowledging that my file now reflected different directives. By mid-afternoon, Harrison had scheduled the evaluation with a specialist, whose reputation he described as unimpeachable. By evening, he had filed a police report noting that I alleged a push at the top of the stairs, attaching my preliminary statement and requesting that officers take photographs of the bruising and order the release of my radiology images because he explained patterned injuries can tell their own stories about angles and forces even when the assailant's story is tidy. Claire arrived the following day wary and bright-eyed, like someone who had slept badly and woken to find the weather changed, and when she saw the copy of Harrison's letter clipped to the foot of my bed, her expression flickered. Fear, irritation, calculation, and then settled into brittle concern as she asked how I was feeling and whether I needed anything from home. And when I told her that Harrison was now handling communications about my care and that I would not be signing any documents. Without him, she said she didn't recognize the man I'd become, that I was letting a stranger tell me what to do, that I was always so stubborn. And then she lowered her voice and tried a different angle, saying, Michael felt terrible about what happened, that he had been having a difficult week at work, that tempers had flared, that perhaps we could all chalk it up to a misunderstanding and move forward. And in that softening, I heard the slick edge of strategy, because if I conceded misunderstanding, then the word push would dissolve into the air, and with it, the leverage to resist what they were already building. I told her I would move forward by returning to my own home with a care plan I approved and with my autonomy intact, and that any move toward guardianship would be met not with appeasement, but with proof. She stared at me as if I had struck her. Then recovered herself and said, with a small shrug, that we all had to do what we believed best. The second escalation began in earnest that afternoon when Harrison learned, through a clerk he knew at the county courthouse, that an emergency petition for temporary guardianship had already been filed in my daughter's name the previous evening, and that the packet included a stack of incident reports describing episodes of confusion, misplaced medications, near kitchen fires, and repeated falls over the last 6 months. Episodes that had never occurred, episodes written in a tone so pious and sorrowful I could hear Michael's cadence hiding behind Claire's signature, and attached to those reports was a letter from a physician whose name I did not recognize, asserting concerns consistent with early cognitive decline based on no examination at all, merely family reports, and at the bottom a request for an expedited hearing due to immediate safety risks. Harrison's jaw tightened as he read. Then he exhaled and said that lies are brittle things when you put heat to them, that we would answer every claim with records, with pharmacy logs, with my primary doctor's notes, documenting stable cognition and safe self-care, and that he would subpoena the mystery physician to explain under oath how he dared diagnose a man he had never met. He filed a counter-motion that same hour, attaching my evaluation appointment, my own doctor's statement, and affidavits from 2 neighbors. Harrison's paralegal had already reached by phone, one of whom, Mrs. Ellison from across the street swore she had seen Michael's arm shoot out toward me at the top of the stairs through the bright rectangle of their front window, after which my body had gone forward as if yanked. The other, a mail carrier who knew our block by heart, recalled hearing raised voices and a thud that made the door rattle as he passed at precisely the time we marked on the ambulance log. To contain the damage, while the court weighed the competing narratives, Harrison moved my assets into a simple, revocable trust, naming me as trustee, and a retired pastor from our old church as successor trustee, a decent, stubborn man who had taught Sunday school with Margaret for 20 years, and who agreed to step in if I were incapacitated, not to serve Claire's convenience, but to serve my written instructions. We changed my accounts to require dual authorization for withdrawals above a modest threshold. We placed transfer on death designations naming my grandchildren, not Claire, for the accounts that permitted it, and we secured a safe deposit box for the documents that mattered most. Margaret's letters, our marriage certificate, tax returns, the deed to my house, the little things that are big when thieves come smiling with familial titles. I did not do this out of spite so much as survival, because when the people who should guard your life turn into auditors of your worth, the only way to stop them is to build a fence that does not ask them for permission. Michael responded, as I knew he would, not by retreating but by pressing harder. 2 days before the hearing, he appeared at the rehabilitation facility to which I had been briefly transferred for physical therapy. His tie loosened, his eyes bright with a caffeinated ferocity that made the hairs on my arms stand up, and he asked to have a word without witnesses, and when I refused, he leaned over my wheelchair as if to whisper, his hand gripping the armrest with just enough pressure to make the plastic creak, and told me that men like me always ended the same way, tucked behind a door in a hallway that smelled like bleach, wondering how it had all happened, and that he was trying to spare me that indignity if only I would stop making everything so dramatic. A nurse stepped in then, small and unafraid, reminding him that intimidation would be reported, and Michael straightened, smiled at her in that managerial way that promises consequences, and left a business card on my lap for a senior living consultant he claimed was a miracle worker. When he had gone, the nurse photographed the red grooves his fingers had left in the soft vinyl and filed an incident report under her own name, and Harrison collected that too, because sometimes malice cannot keep its hands to itself. It was not all grimness and legal filings. In the small hours of one morning when the ward was quiet and the machine beeps had settled into a sedated rhythm, my granddaughter slipped into the room like a shadow, her hair pulled back, her face pale and intent, and she pressed a folded note into my palm with the clumsy secrecy of someone who has rehearsed courage alone in the mirror. She whispered that she loved me, that she was sorry, that she and her brother had heard enough to know the truth, and then she tapped her phone and showed me a voice memo. The low murmur of a late-night conversation in the kitchen at their house. Michael saying he couldn't believe the old man still had that much fight, that a good scare would have moved this along months ago, and Claire, my daughter, my little girl, answering in a voice frayed with fear that he needed to stop talking like that she didn't want to hear it even if it was true, because if anyone ever found out it would ruin everything. I did not take the phone or ask her to send it, because I would not place that weight on her shoulders, but I nodded and told her that what she had already given me, a look in the eyes that said I was not alone, was more than enough, and she cried. Without sound, and fled before the door opened again. I told Harrison the existence of the recording without giving details that would put her in direct crosshairs, and he said that even the suggestion of it might be enough to make Michael's lawyer blanch, because any attorney knows a jury can hear a guilty whisper long after a judge moves to strike it from the record. The blows did not stop. Claire visited my house while I was away, and, under the pretense of tidying for your return, packed up boxes of Margaret's things, including the blue shawl she had knitted the winter before she died, and the recipe cards. Browned with years of use, and when I learned of it from a neighbor who saw her loading the car, I felt a fury so clean I surprised myself, and I called Harrison to document the removal, and then I called Claire to tell her to bring every box back, untouched, because the past was not hers to erase for the convenience of a new narrative in which I was already absent. She tried to spin it as kindness, as an act of preparation, as relief for my supposed anxiety, and I told her calmly that if she brought the boxes back there would be no police report. She delivered them before sunset and left them on the porch, without knocking, and I sat awake that night remembering how small she had once been in my arms, how frightened of thunderstorms, how she had pressed her face into my shirt and breathed until the panic passed, and I wondered at the distance between that child and this woman whose love bent so easily toward control. On the morning of the hearing, the sky was washed pale and cold, and Harrison wheeled me into the courtroom where the fluorescent lights flattened everyone's faces into versions of themselves they could not edit, and I saw Michael in a charcoal suit, standing too straight, his mouth set as if he were about to deliver a proposal to a boardroom, and Claire beside him with a softness painted on that fooled no one who had ever seen her as a determined child. Their attorney rose to speak in the tone of civic concern, describing a father slipping into frailty, a home filled with hazards, a loving family desperate to protect him from himself. And then his script faltered when Harrison began to lay down these counterweights. My primary physician's letter attesting to stable cognition and safe independent living, the scheduled neuropsychological exam by a doctor the court itself respected, the affidavits from Mrs. Ellison and the mail carrier, the nurse's incident report about Michael's grip and remarks, the pharmacy logs showing my prescriptions filled and taken on schedule, the simple, stubborn arithmetic of a life still coherently lived. The judge did not rule that day. Courts rarely deliver the clean endings we crave, but he declined the emergency petition, ordered the independent evaluation, and warned both parties that any further attempts to shift property or decision-making without clear consent would be sanctioned, and as the gavel tapped, I saw a muscle jump in Michael's jaw, a tiny betrayal of the control he prized. When we returned to the facility, Harrison sat on the edge of the visitor's chair and told me we had bought time, that time was sometimes the only currency that mattered because men who scheme hate long games. They become clumsy under delay. They show their hands, and while we waited for the evaluation, we would continue to fortify the small, practical defenses. A Ring camera installed by the parish handyman at my front door, not as a trap, but as a witness that does not get intimidated, a list of callers authorized to receive medical information with Claire and Michael conspicuously absent, a calendar of physical therapy visits that I memorized to show the evaluators I was not only lucid, but engaged. That evening I asked him to draft one more document, a will that did what my heart had already done in secret, leaving small legacies to my grandchildren for their education, and leaving to Claire nothing but a letter written in my own hand explaining, that love is not entitlement and that betrayal carries its own inheritance. And though he warned me that such words might inflame rather than soothe, I told him there is a difference between cruelty and clarity, and that a man is permitted one last, clear sentence about what mattered most. Claire called that night from an unfamiliar number, perhaps thinking that if she bypassed the caller ID, I would answer with my old ease, and when I did, she exhaled as if we had both been spared, then began to cry in the practiced way of someone who has learned that tears can open doors, telling me that this had gotten out of hand, that she never meant for it to go so far, that she wished we could speak without lawyers, just father and daughter, and for a moment a part of me reached out. Instinctively, the part that has always wanted to mend rather than tear, but then she said we could avoid further ugliness if I would simply agree to temporary oversight so she could sleep at night. And in that word, temporary, I heard the steel. Trap clicked shut, and I told her we could speak as father and daughter any time she was ready to say out loud what we both knew about the stairs. She went quiet, then cold, and said I was choosing strangers over family, and I answered that it was family who had made strangers necessary. After she hung up, I sat in the dim television glow and pressed my palm to my ribs where the bruises had faded to yellow, and I understood that pain is a teacher that asks for tuition in advance, and I had paid, and I would finish the course. The second escalation, then, was not a single blow, but a tightening loop, a series of calculated moves meant to corner me into surrender, and with each turn of the loop, I learned another skill I never wanted to acquire. How to say no without apology, how to insist on precision when others benefit from blur, how to let the law, which I had always found tedious, stand like a fence between me and the people who believed love entitled them to take. And though the days were long and the nights longer, I felt something inside me toughen into a quiet resolve that no staircase, no petition, no performance of concern could shake. The culmination came on the day of the independent evaluation, though the appointment itself was only the stage on which months of humiliation, resistance, and hidden maneuvers finally converged into something that could no longer be disguised. The specialist, Dr. Marlowe, was a man of late middle age with a calm manner that carried neither condescension nor pity, and when he wheeled me into his quiet office lined with books and test kits, I felt as though for the first time in weeks I was not being treated like an object of suspicion, but as a person whose mind was still his own. The tests were long and varied, words to recall, patterns to repeat, numbers to subtract, puzzles to arrange, and though fatigue pulled at me, I forced myself to steady every answer, to concentrate with the same tenacity with which I had once prepared. Lesson plans for a classroom full of restless teenagers, and when at last he set down his pen and folded his hands, he said softly that in his professional judgment there was no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment, that my capacity was intact, and that his report would reflect this in language so firm it could not be bent. Yet the true climax was not the evaluation itself but what followed, because as Harrison wheeled me out into the corridor, Michael appeared with Claire trailing behind him, both of them pale with tension. Michael demanded to know what had been said, what conclusions had been drawn. And when Harrison replied curtly that results would go to the court in due course, Michael's composure cracked, and in a voice that was too loud for the narrow hallway, he accused me of manipulating the system, of dragging strangers into family matters, of turning his own children against him with my poison. The words echoed off the walls, nurses glanced over, and I sat still in my chair, watching the performance unravel, because for once he was the one who had lost control. Claire tried to hush him, gripping his arm, but he shook her off and stepped closer to me, his finger jabbing the air as he said that everything I owned, everything I clung to, was built on borrowed time, that sooner or later I would be gone and it would all pass to them, and that if I thought a piece of paper could change, that I was delusional. It was then that my granddaughter, who had insisted on accompanying me, drew her phone from her pocket and, with a trembling hand, pressed the screen to record. Her eyes locked on mine as if asking permission. I gave the faintest nod, because here at last was the unguarded truth spilling from Michael's own mouth, not whispered in a kitchen at midnight, but declared in the open where anyone might hear. Harrison intervened then, his voice firm, telling Michael that he had said enough, that his outburst was being documented, and that any further intimidation would be grounds for legal sanction. Michael sneered, but for the first time I saw uncertainty flicker in his expression, the dawning awareness that the fortress of lies he had built was crumbling under the weight of his own temper. The following week in court, the evaluation report was read aloud, its conclusions unequivocal. I was competent, independent, and capable of managing my own affairs. The judge, who had listened with careful neutrality throughout the earlier hearings, now allowed a sharper edge into his voice as he turned to Claire and Michael, asking why such extreme measures had been pursued on the basis of fabricated incidents and second-hand reports. Harrison then submitted the nurse's statement about Michael's threatening visit, the affidavits from the neighbors, and at last, with a gravity that silenced the room, he played the brief recording my granddaughter had captured in the corridor. Michael's voice ringing out with the words about everything I owned eventually being theirs. Claire buried her face in her hands, Michael's lawyer paled, and the judge banged the gavel for order, his face stern as he declared that not only was the petition for guardianship denied, but that he was referring the matter to the district attorney for potential investigation into elder abuse and coercion. As I sat there in the courtroom, my body still aching but my spirit alight, I felt the release of months of fear and indignity. It was not triumph in the sense of conquest, for I had lost too much already, the innocence of trust, the quiet faith in my daughter's loyalty, the unbroken image of family as sanctuary. But it was triumph in survival, in refusing to be erased, and forcing the truth to stand where lies had tried to settle. Michael stared at me with a hatred so sharp it could have cut glass, and Claire would not meet my eyes, but in that moment their power over me dissolved, because the law had recognized what love had failed to protect. When the hearing adjourned, Harrison helped me out into the sunlight, the crisp air filling my lungs, with a clarity I had not felt since before the fall. My granddaughter slipped her hand into mine, her grip warm and steady, and whispered that she was proud of me, that she had seen now what strength meant, not in shouting or in striking back, but in enduring, in holding to the truth until it broke. Through. I looked at her then and thought of Margaret, of the legacy she had left me, not in possessions, but in resilience, and I knew that whatever years remained to me, they would not be lived as a man diminished, but as a man who had faced betrayal and still stood scarred but unbroken. That was the climax, not the victory of one man over another, but the restoration of a voice nearly stolen, the affirmation that even in the twilight of life, when the world is eager to write you off, you can still rise and force the record to reflect the truth. And in that recognition, I felt the quiet dignity of having risen higher than the man who had once pushed me down, because he had revealed himself to be smaller than his schemes, while I, even in frailty, had proven larger than his malice. When the court doors closed behind us and the hallway noise thinned into the ordinary hum of a building going back to its business, I felt the strange lightness that follows a long storm. Not elation exactly, because there were no winners in what we had done, only people who had finally stopped pretending, yet there was a clarity I had not tasted since before Margaret died, a sense that the world had tilted back by a few essential degrees, and with that steadiness I returned to my house and began the slow work of living as a man who had chosen order over fear. Harrison helped me secure a protective order that set a legal distance between Michael and me, not because I wanted to brand him like a criminal trophy, but because paper, when it bears a judge's signature, has a way of stiffening the spine of those who mistake kindness for weakness, and the district attorney's office opened its quiet file, asked its careful questions, collected its affidavits, and told me in a tone both sympathetic and professional that these things move at the speed of proof, which is to say slower than anger but faster than denial. And while their machinery turned, I attended to the smaller machinery of my days, meeting the contractor to add a second handrail to the staircase, laying down non-slip treads with the stubborn precision of a man who refuses to be felled by the same place twice, and marking with a pencil the height of each rise, as if to say to the house and to myself that the steepness I once feared now belonged to me, I hired a physical therapist who did not treat me as a relic, but as a project with muscles to be coaxed and lungs to be persuaded, and we measured progress not in dramatic leaps, but in the honest arithmetic of effort. 10 steps without the cane, 20 with the groceries in one hand, a full flight while reciting the names of my grandchildren so that breath and memory worked together like old friends relearning a dance. And sometimes when I reached the landing at the top, I would stand there with my palm on the new rail and let the hot sting in my knees remind me that victory often looks like ordinary movement restored. Claire wrote once, a long email that read like a confession and drafted by committee, apologies threaded through excuses, and at the end a request to meet somewhere neutral so we could find a path that honors everyone. And I answered with a single paragraph so that there would be no mistaking my meaning, telling her that I had found a path already, one that honored truth, that I was open to speaking when she was ready to call the shove what it was and to stop using the language of care, to smother the language of control, and until then our communication would be through counsel. Not because I wanted distance, but because distance was the only bridge left that did not collapse under the weight of our history. The grandchildren came on Saturdays, never together at first, then cautiously in a pair, and we formed our own plain ritual that had no place for speeches or tears, just sandwiches at the kitchen table where Margaret used to hum while chopping. Onions, a slow walk around the block with them telling me about exams and broken guitar strings and a dog they hoped to adopt, and every so often their stories would stop mid-sentence and one of them would search my face, as if checking that I was still in the ways that mattered, their grandfather and not a courtroom exhibit, and I would tell them that love survives the machinery built to grind it down if you oil it with attention, and they would smile without quite understanding, and we would keep walking. I finished the trust documents and the will, not with malice, but with a clean hand, setting aside small scholarships that would spring open when the two of them needed tuition or a flight to an internship interview, leaving the house to be sold with proceeds divided between causes Margaret and I had given to in our thin years and our respectable years alike. Library literacy programs, the church pantry, a fund for teachers who buy supplies from their own pockets. Because I wanted what had nearly been stolen to become something multiplied rather than something hoarded. And when I signed the last page, I felt the odd, bracing calm of a man who has finally arranged his affairs according to the shape of his heart rather than the noise of other people's plans. Word reached me, as word always does in towns that are too large to be intimate and too small to be anonymous, that Michael had taken a leave from his firm after an internal matter, that the board did not like the smell of court transcripts even, when no conviction had ripened, and that his temper, which he had once handled like a private tool, had started to betray him in meetings where he no longer trusted to be opposed. And I did not smile or gloat because I am too old to pretend that another man's fall heals your own bruises, yet I did feel the sober satisfaction of a scale adjusting itself when no human hand is visible on the beam. On a quiet evening in early autumn, I carried a wooden box up the stairs, slowly, evenly, without stopping. And in that box were Margaret's recipe cards and the blue shawl, which still held a faint trace of her lavender drawer sachets, and at the top. Landing, I paused where my body had once been most afraid, laid the box on the step, and let the past sit beside me like a companion who tells the truth without cruelty. The dusk came through the window in that old, forgiving gold, and I said aloud, because sometimes a man must hear his own voice to believe it, that I forgave the part of Claire that was a frightened child in a grown woman's armor, that I forgave the younger version of myself who mistook patience for a cure, and that I even forgave Michael from a distance, not to absolve him, but to release the hook he had left in my flesh. Because forgiveness, when it is properly understood, is not a gift to the offender, but a key that unlocks the cell you built with your own rage. In the months that followed, I found small, durable ways to live forward. I joined the Tuesday morning group at the library where retired teachers read with children whose parents were working double shifts. I mended the gate latch that had clicked. Crookedly, since the summer Claire learned to ride her bike, I planted a pair of rose bushes Margaret had always said the yard needed and watched them take, stubborn and bright, even as the temperature dropped, and when I looked at them from the kitchen window while the kettle sang, I understood, without drama, that rising higher than the man who pushed me was not a matter of courts or headlines or even apologies. It was the daily choice to claim my own breath, my own steps, my own peace, and to leave behind the staircase of other people's hunger. On the first snow of winter, the grandchildren helped me lay salt on the front steps and teased me about walking too fast, and I told them I had never felt steadier, which was true in the only way that matters, because the stairs that once tried to carry me down now carried me up, and at the top I turned and looked at what I had climbed, not with bravado, but with the quiet pride of a man who knows that sometimes the highest place is simply the landing where you decide to keep living.